Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is just a follow-up on the 5 steps to managing peroxide-forming chemicals that we had put out a few months back. And in that we covered some of the common peroxide formers, discussed do's and don'ts, training, when potentially to discard, and kind of gave a brief outline on planning and kind of what it would take to implement a plan. So the purpose of today is to kind of get into that a little bit more and discuss, what the materials are that you have to be concerned with, some of the things that work, some of the things that go into a peroxide management program that we've found success with in some of our programs, and at the end have a couple case studies that we'll share with you as well for the implementation of the plan.
All right, Ted, the poll's all set if you want to continue on with your presentation.
All right. So today we'll go over, just give the brief overview. We'll discuss regulations. I mentioned before the program implementation and management piece to it. The biggest concern is potential peroxide forming chemicals over time. Typically materials, and throughout the presentation we'll talk about potentially energetic, the material being potentially energetic materials, and it's really over time is the biggest concern with these materials, depending upon how they come in. And there's a couple different examples depending upon the research and the use and applicability of the material. Some will have inhibitors versus others that do not, which we will get into in a little bit. The biggest concern is the potential threat to health and safety for it. And in a lot of cases, when we've come in to do peroxide deactivations or any stabilizations, we've found that there's not really a structured program to cover these materials. So all the materials, the potential peroxide formers, which there are a handful of common peroxide formers, ethyl ether, isopropyl ether, tetrahydrofuran, dioxane, being the most common. Sorry about that. Being the most common that we will see over time. They will the material can break down, and a lot of these come in with peroxide formers, or come in with inhibitors, I should say, and usually like a hydroquinone or BHT that can help inhibit any peroxide formation. But as people have gotten different types of research, they've found that they want inhibitor-free materials, and we've actually run into more and more of the ethers and tetrahydrofurans, dioxins that are all actually inhibitor-free. And when you run into inhibitor-free material, we're seeing that timeline and that shrink a little bit. So depending upon that you run into, or the different atmosphere conditions, you can help accelerate the breakdown of the inhibitors, which can cause problems, as well as for the inhibitor-free materials, those atmospheric conditions can help accelerate that peroxide formation and make a hazard. So again, I mentioned some of the common ones: ethyl ether, tetrahydrofuran, isopropyl ether, and dioxane, which I mentioned already. But the other one is for solids is sodium amide, which is unique in being a solid. It actually will form peroxides over time, and we've had a handful of cases where we had to come in for sodium amides and physically react it off. When you do have a peroxide in research settings. Really the friction, which could be opening the cap, heat depending upon how the material is stored, or in some cases researchers heat up the solvents, and when if they have peroxides in them, they'll go off. And then shock, where potentially putting the bottle down could be an issue. So, and again, as these materials age, the biggest concern would be the safe handling of them. This is an example of a tetrahydrofuran we found in a cleanout, and a lot of the ones that we find are from cleanouts. Excuse me one quick second, I apologize. There we go. Sorry about that. This was a tetrahydrofuran from a cleanout, and as you can see, there's material at the bottom of it. When we tested the material, tested over 100 parts per million for peroxides on this one. You can see, there's crystals. Generally, this was a pretty concentrated amount. Depending upon the peroxide concentration, when you have a solution that has peroxide formers, you may just get a cloudy, milky look to it. You may see some material floating in the solution. It does also, does settle, as in the picture, at the bottom of the material. So in this case, we had to go in, when we found this one, we had to end up stabilizing it and reacting off the peroxides. Another one, this one we came across in a laboratory. It was identified, they saw the material. This was another tetrahydrofuran bottle, and this was inhibitor free. It wasn't that old. It was this one was around a year and a little older. Had the material floated. There's sitting at the bottom of it. We went in and we tested this one. It actually this one had a SureSeal cap on it that had kind of fallen apart, and this one tested negative for peroxides, but that was just some material. So it's not always, the biggest thing is there's not always peroxides in them, but the evaluation piece is really key in identification, before trying to move anything. And this was a 30-plus-year-old sodium amide that we found in another lab cleanout that we did. As you can see, it looks pretty nasty. There's material caked on the outside of it as well. And this was, sodium amide is typically white or gray, but as peroxides start to form, it starts to change color, which is anytime you see any sort of chemical change, I mentioned the milky view, cloudy view, or material floating in the material. There's some chemical change going on. For sodium amide, it changes color. So whenever you come across those chemical changes, there's definitely something going on. You need to evaluate the material and figure out what you're dealing with before you can handle it. So from a regulatory standpoint, there have been incidents with peroxide formers, but there is very little regulation with it. The safety piece really falls under OSHA with the general duty clause, but the only other guidance out there, the NFPA, and some has peroxide former storage, and they've established timelines with that within their guidelines. And the other part to that, which will build upon the fire department, will then enforce the NFPA guidelines. But other than that, there's no real guidance, or there's not much guidance out there for peroxide formers. What are peroxide formers? Good list and how to manage the material. But the NFPA has a nice structure with timelines. And then the states really are the only part. The states only come into play when you need to treat the material, and depending upon the state that you're in, you may or may not need permission. I know we have people all the way down, from all over the country on on this webinar, depending upon your state, you may or may not need permits. Up in New England, we need permits to treat any material. We need state approval for everything with the exception of Connecticut. And when you get into New York and New Jersey, you do not need any written approvals from the states. But as you kind of work your way down the East Coast, get into the Mid-Atlantic, there are some states that you do need permits for and state approval, like in Maryland. Other states you don't need any, and as you kind of work your way down, getting down to Florida, where you don't need any state approval for those. But it is really state by state. But that's really the only time that the states are going to be getting involved for it. So when we do have a material that's been identified as it's a potential peroxide former, it's been identified to have material in it or potentially have material in it, we have to, we go through that work plan and that approval, or we just work with the clients, going through the work plan, finding an isolated area, low traffic, where we can, close to where the storage location is, so that we can move the material safely with little, if no additional people in the area. And then, we're performing it typically off hours. It's usually late night, early mornings. Saturdays recently have been the most popular for these, just for ease. So those are usually the times that we have to perform the work. Depending upon the state, again, with the approvals, you may need to do notifications as well to the newspaper. You have to post something in the newspaper. You may have to, if you're in a complex or a building with multiple tenants in it, in your research building, you may have to notify all of them if the state requires it as well prior to doing the work. And then in some cases, we have to have the fire department on site with us as a detail, just in the event that something was to go wrong, or there's a fire department, at the very least, a fire department notification for that. So there's a lot that goes into the material once you identify that you have a potential energetic material for stabilization. And as we're going through when we're putting together the work plan and kind of evaluating the material, or as you're evaluating the material on site, it's really getting as much information as possible. If some institutions do this work themselves and have had go through the evaluation and handling process, but having as much information as possible is really key, because you need to know what the hazards of the material are, as well as what it's soluble in, and what the actual what the true hazard is. People how do you handle a potential peroxide former? Some people think that dilution is possible. So if you have a solvent like an ether with concentrated peroxides, some people have poured water on it, into it, thinking that they can kind of dilute down the peroxides, which really only kind of concentrates the peroxides as the ether and water separate. So, and after the fact, we've been called in to kind of handle those situations. But for peroxide, you actually have to deactivate the material. Dilution will not work as it would with other potential energetic materials. So really having an understanding of what you're dealing with is very, very important. The biggest thing is to ultimately how to avoid any remote opening, any off-hours work. All the work that we do, typically, about 95% of the material of these remote openings can be prevented, be avoided completely. The biggest thing that we see as we kind of go through and do evaluations, we're seeing, there's improper storage, there's no preventative maintenance, and the bulk purchasing, the 2-for-1 deals, and then it's material that take years and years to use, that just end up sitting around. those are typically the times when when the material will just be discovered, and then we'll be called in to kind of take care of it. So addressing these three issues can really help with the elimination or reduction of any chemicals that could become peroxide form or form peroxides or become a potential high haz event. The biggest challenge, and this is kind of institution based, no two places are the same, and there's no cookie cutter. There's a basis which we're going to cover and go through today, but there's no kind of program that will fit into everywhere. It really depends upon your institution. So the challenge is to kind of develop the SOP that kind of fits your institution, and getting the program up and running to prevent any of these containers from becoming a permit or a high hazard event. And the first part is, depending upon what you have at your disposal, gathering the information is typically the biggest struggle. If there's, depending upon, so if you don't have a chemical inventory program or a central purchasing location, or don't have, those laboratory inventories, it can make it very difficult, and especially for large institutions with, several hundred labs, it can be very difficult to gather the information. But one of the things that we found in some of the programs is that, working with the researchers and with the different departments, we've found that's really been very helpful in getting the program going. It really helps also for tracking purposes, getting all the information and getting the lab people to inventory the material by shelf unit, by different cabinet, not just a blanket inventory, just to kind of give as much information as possible, really give them a behind it, as opposed to just say that you're looking for a chemical inventory of their lab. Give them a reason behind it. The best one, the fire departments, most fire departments require chemical inventories for, so that's one, and they will enforce it a lot. A lot of fire departments, and more fire departments we're seeing, are really enforcing that chemical inventory piece, that flammable storage and limitation piece. So getting that inventory can really help on a couple different fronts. It can help, one, gathering the information that you need for the high hazard or potential peroxide former evaluation, but can also help with getting what you need for the fire department. After that, it's kind of really customizing it to your facility, what's going to work best. You have the information. How do you maintain that information? How do you follow up? So it's really, again, really going to depend upon your facility and what will work best. But size and resources will be, will definitely play into part in this, as well as if you have, what you have at your disposal. If you have, again, central purchasing or some way of controlling purchasing, that makes everything a lot easier. We've had, do work with facilities and institutions that have that control, and they limit how much people have, what they can buy of the different peroxide formers when it's received. They keep track of it, and it's checked on periodically, which we will get into in a little bit. So I mentioned, that management system, including who can purchase the materials, if that's possible, to limit, who can purchase different materials, how much they can purchase at one time. Really kind of limiting where or how it can be stored. And in some cases, that will be, depending upon the setup of your institution, that may already be determined. For flammable storage, you may have designated areas for that, so that may help with controlling the amounts of material or where the material is stored. The tricky one is the enforcement of the system and how it's how that's going to work for you. But it ultimately comes down to the investment in the implementation and the management. Putting together a management system in the long run will really save you money. So in a lot of cases, again, depending on the size of your group, your environmental health and safety group, and the resources available to you, a lot of this information or these systems can be implemented with existing staff. I mentioned the purchasing and receiving, not to continuously come back to purchasing, but that really is a big part of it and very, very key. If that can be addressed, that really helps, especially in the bulk purchasing of material. That can really control that. The receiving piece, if you can track the material, so then you have a start date. So you know how old the material is and you know how much is coming into your institution. From a awareness and training standpoint, chemical hygiene plans, whenever anyone is getting trained on a chemical hygiene plan, you can work kind of just an overview, hazards, hazard evaluation and potential for that material. If it's stored too long, just the hazards identified with it. Because a lot of researchers will understand the chemistry behind it. They know that ether will form peroxides, but they may not know the hazard or what causes that formation or how long the material should be stored. Because after, as the material gets older, the peroxides are more likely to form. They don't always understand that part of it, which can be useful. And working with management in getting that into the chemical hygiene plan can be helpful. Then also once you have that information, you have the inventories, you've got the training and the awareness is out there. The lab personnel in some cases can do and again, this is going to be dependent upon your institution, but in some cases, the lab personnel for clients that we work with will evaluate the peroxides. They have peroxide awareness training. They know who or what to look for, and when there's an issue, they'll call environmental health and safety. So using the lab personnel can really be to identify potential peroxide forms can be very helpful. And then doing a periodic check-in, an inspection, a follow-up inspection done by environmental health and safety can be very helpful. So just to make sure everything is running smoothly. And this, again, the biggest part with the development of the SOP is making it the best management practice for your institution. So some of the things that we've done and coming up with a form that can document any high hazard material, either in an email format or in some cases there's web-based forms, some way of making it easy for people to track, for environmental health and safety personnel to track what laboratories have what, and make it easy for the lab personnel as well, because obviously they're more likely to do it if it's a email or a web-based form. They're more likely to do the work and give you the information that you need. And then creating an inspection form that needs to be an evaluation form that needs to be created on some sort of schedule. Now, it's going to again depend upon the size of your institution and also who's doing the evaluations, but it could be quarterly, it could be every 6 months, or once a year. It really depends upon what works, but get those forms together, get them submitted, and then do a review of the forms and provide any feedback, identify any areas where you may need to visit, kind of the potential problem areas, material that's getting up in age, it hasn't changed, you're doing quarterly assessments and the material is still there. It doesn't seem to be going away. They're not using it at all. You may be able to say, okay, you can go visit that lab and see if they want to dispose the material, and then you can get rid of it before it becomes before it's formed any peroxide, it becomes a high hazard material. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you can never, really give the lab too much information. They understand the different solvents and what, the chemistry behind it and what they are going to use it for, but they don't always understand or know what causes the peroxide formation. So it's really, storage, how the material is stored, if it's in a cool, dry place or if it's in a cool, dry, dark place. Those are better places for storing any of the ethers and tetrahydrofuran's dioxanes and isopropyl ethers, because it really comes down to light, air, and heat are the three things that will really either break down an inhibitor over time or will aid in the formation of peroxides. And I mentioned those four solvents, but there are more out there. There are a lot of different guidance documents out there. Some of the chemical companies have the peroxide formers. Donald Clark from Texas A&M has a nice comprehensive list. He's a chemical safety officer for Texas A&M. He has a nice he's published a nice list of potential peroxide formers. So there is a lot of information out there. There are a lot of potential peroxide formers. So getting people familiar with those, getting the staff familiar with those, as well as giving them, what to look for, and then the hazards and the storage piece and how they need to handle it. And it's not only the inhibitor, the material with inhibitors, but it's also the inhibitor-free ones are really the ones that need to be watched closely, because there's nothing. Once you get you get some light and get some in a warm place, get it exposed to some air, you're starting the potential peroxide formation has already started. And a lot of those bottles have sure seal caps on them, but during use, sometimes the septums will break, as shown in that earlier picture, or kind of fall apart, and then air is getting readily into those bottles, and you can get peroxide formation. Another way, besides giving them that information, getting into lab meetings has been helpful. We've sat in on lab meetings with staff and kind of given overviews. Worked with some of our clients in EH&S that regularly get into lab meetings and kind of go through and answer any questions that lab people have. Found to be very successful. And the biggest thing is really letting the potential safety issues for the individual, let them know what the hazard would be, what the outcome could potentially be. And in a lot of the remote openings that we work on, there's always, there's usually pictures that the environmental health and safety group are taking, and they're working them into trainings to show the lab staff of the kind of worst case. So mismanagement, what does it lead to? And they kind of go through the whole event, and that's been very successful for some of our clients as well. So now I wanted to kind of get into a couple case studies that we have. We do this work at many of our clients, but I wanted to focus on a couple of our clients up here in Boston. When we have one of our larger universities in the Boston area, we started this program a few years back. We started it doing a walkthrough of all their laboratories once a year. taking an inventory, identifying any potential peroxide formers. We also any potential explosives. And kind of give a lab by lab breakout of the different chemicals, any dates that may be on it, age, and include recommendations. And we walk through the entire campus. We've now upped that to a twice a year evaluation through all the labs, creating the reports, again, working with the laboratory people, evaluating material, that, doing that check. If in January I had it, I identified the material, it was from 2012. It was, a full bottle, never been opened. I go back, still never been opened. Is that a material that they're going to use, and kind of having that discussion, identifying that material, bringing it back to EH&S, and the Environmental Health and Safety Group is talking with the laboratories to see if they need it. And in some cases we're removing any material before it becomes an issue. We do testing. Any questionable material, if they want to keep it, if we identify it as a peroxide former, we test it. We note the date, assuming that there's no peroxides in it. We are, dating it, noting the peroxide concentration 0, and then, leaving it in the laboratory. Some of the other ones that we flag for disposal, we are evaluating, testing them if need be, or testing them for peroxide formation, and kind of, hopefully assuming there's, no contamination, we're disposing of it before it becomes an issue. As a result of this walkthrough that we started a few years back, we've actually been able to eliminate any high hazard events for this client. So it's been a very successful program for us and for them. It saves a tremendous amount of money. Another case study we have is for a large biotech that we do work with in Boston. This one's a little different. They have a chemical inventory for everything on site, so it's a little easier. So they have a system set up where upon receipt, a receive date is entered, and we know what lab it went to. So we run the reports, so we can see a report throughout the year of the material, the potential peroxide formers, identify anything that may be an issue, and go to laboratories and test the material if need be. So we're doing that review on a regular basis, on a routine basis. We also do an annual walkthrough of the laboratories to make sure that, while it may be, we based on the inventory, we do it based on date, and we can identify things, but really, those conditions, the atmospheric conditions and storage conditions, really play a big part into peroxide formation. So we do walkthroughs of the laboratories once a year, wherever we have identified peroxide or potential peroxide formers. And if there's material that is questionable, we work with the labs and EH&S, and we take the material and we remove it for disposal. And again, this is one we have had, since this implementation of this program, we have not had any remote openings. We haven't had to do anything. So we've, again, it's been a very successful program that we're continuing to do on a routine basis just to keep it running. But again, it is a huge cost savings for our clients, and very valuable service. That, are there any questions?
All right, guys, so we're opening it up to questions now. Anybody who has any questions can, again, type them into the questions pane. I noticed one of you guys had your hands raised. You don't need to do that. Just type them into the chat pane where you can ask questions. All right, so someone wants to know, at what concentration should peroxide formers be disposed? And then at what concentration should they become concerned?
So, depending upon, I mean, once you have some peroxide formation, it's started the process, so it's only going to concentrate further from there. So if you, depending upon the type of work, once you get anything starting to form peroxides, you get a hit for it, that material should be disposed of, because the concentrations are only going to increase. And the higher the concentrations, the more hazardous the material. There is a lot of different things out there as far as from a hazard standpoint. I mean, part of it is, the shock piece. They're at, usually 80 to 100, anything above 80 parts per million is definitely cause for concern from a safe handling standpoint. Smaller, the lower amounts can be, could potentially be safely handled, again, depending upon where it falls. The other part to that would be if the facility can handle the material, where you're going to dispose of the material, if they will take any peroxide concentration at all. So it's not only the safe handling, I would say, is, when you have cause for concern, 80, even to be conservative, you can say 50, anything above 50. But when you get into that 80 range, that's really when you want to get rid of that material. And any of the lower concentrations, in a lot of cases, and most commonly, or most recently, what we've been seeing is a lot of tetrahydrofuran coming in around 30 parts per million of peroxides. And had about 6 different locations, 6 different institutions that have had this just within the last month and a half. And at that point, the 30 parts per million, it's not something that they can use, and we've been removing the material.
Great, thanks. Oops, sorry, I thought you were done.
All right.
Are you all done?
Yes.
Okay, so I didn't mean to cut you off. All right, great. We have a lot of questions coming in. Just so you guys know, if we don't get to your questions during the webinar, we will still answer it via email afterwards, so feel free to ask it anyways. I have a few people asking about the slides, just so you guys know. Tomorrow morning, everybody will receive a copy of the slides as well as a recording of the webinar. So you will get that in your email inbox tomorrow morning. Next question. Someone says, you mentioned guidance documents. Could you point us in the direction of additional information / guidance documents regarding peroxide formers and assistance in creating a SOP to manage PFs, peroxide formers?
The guidance documents with the list of materials, that can be any, sigma chemical, for chemical list of potential peroxide formers. I mentioned Donald E. Clark from Texas A&M, who put together peroxides and peroxide forming compounds. That's out on the, you can get that right off the web. It gives good guidance, a good list of material. As far as management, the NFPA has within their guidelines, they have timelines, depending upon which potential peroxide former you have. They have the type A, type B. Type A's are extremely likely to form peroxides, and those are usually 3-month storage. Then there's type B, which is 6-month. There's other guidance out there that for a year, or depending upon the group C, be around a year before you discard the material. So the NFPA has some guidance out there. As well, as far as putting together a management plan, it's more of the hazard around the material, identifying the material, and kind of a timeline. As far as management, there isn't much out there that I've seen. It's just really kind of this is, if you have ethyl ether, you store it, you hold on to it for no longer than 1 year, and then at that time, from when you received it, you dispose of the material. This is kind of the guidance that's out there. There's no formal guidance program that I'm aware of, but I mean, for references to peroxide forming chemicals, the NFPA and kind of the timeline piece, Donald E. Clark with his write-up on peroxides and peroxide forming compounds are really good guides.
Great, thanks. So the next one, someone wants to know which are the most energetic and sensitive peroxides.
For the peroxide, potential peroxide formers, the isopropyl ether is one. I mentioned that the category A kind of classification. Isopropyl ether is very common to get peroxides. Ethyl ether, tetrahydrofuran, dioxane. Those are really the four big ones that we run into that typically have peroxides. As they get older, those are the most common ones that we run into. I mean, the list is long, and it's really, it's based on the chemical structure, but those are really the big four that we run into.
Great. Someone wants to know if you can speak about iron as being a natural inhibitor. Is there enough iron in metal so that it can decrease the risks of peroxides being formed?
So, I mean, so iron, I guessing when you're talking like in a rusty container, I guess would be one thought that comes to mind. And there's, I mean, if you're getting rust, you're getting that oxidation. So the iron is taking the oxygen that could potentially be used in the formation of peroxide. So that would work. I know so that does work. It does take some of the oxygen. The concern that we run into with a rusty container is the inside of the container rusty. But iron in general, I mean, we use iron in the deactivation process in our peroxide deactivation solution that we put together. When we use iron. So iron, it is effective for helping with peroxide deactivation or inhibition.
Okay, great. Someone wants to know what the best way to field test for peroxides is.
Depending upon the first part, I mean, the Quantifix peroxide strips, depending upon, they sell different ppm levels. You can do 100 parts per million, or there are 1,000 parts per million papers. Those are the kind of the quickest and the easiest ways to do it. Before testing the peroxides, I would stress just the evaluation of the container prior to opening or handling it, and making sure that it is actually the person doing that testing and evaluation is someone that's trained and familiar with it, because of the hazard. If the material does have concentrated peroxides, there could be a potential issue. So it should definitely be done by a trained person, and just let any person do it.
Okay. Someone has a related question regarding safe concentrations from the question you asked a few questions ago. They want to know, at what concentration would a peroxide former become a high hazard or a remote opening situation?
So it's really, and it depends upon the what you have at your disposal. It's typically, by definition of treatment, again, depending upon your state, and that plays into the piece about or the permit requirement. So if you need to treat the material to make it more amenable for a facility to accept it, or for disposal, by definition, in some cases that is treatment, and then you would need to then you would need to get that permit. And it depends on what facilities. We do work with facilities that we have that will accept small concentrations. It really kind of depends on what you have available to you.
Great. We have a question coming from New York. They just want to clarify, in New York, stabilization is not considered treatment, correct?
Well, in New York, you're allowed to do treatment in tanks and containers under the regulations. So, I mean, you can a stabilization. So that's stabilization within, it's treatment within tanks and containers. So it's done within the regulations under that part. Now, depending upon when you say stabilization, which part of it. If you're deactivating peroxides, you're doing a treatment. You're removing a hazard from the material. If you're proactively putting an inhibitor into a solution and stabilizing it, then that's okay. Or that doesn't play into it at all. But New York's regulations allow you to do treatment in tanks and containers, and a deactivation would be considered a treatment.
Great. Someone wants to know if you'd consider hydrogen peroxide in the peroxide forming category, and if so, how would you manage it?
So hydrogen peroxide is an oxidizer. By nature, the higher concentrations is also corrosive. It's an inorganic oxidizer, so hydrogen peroxide by itself is not, you can consider it a peroxide former. So it's, so that I would just, from a handling standpoint, I mean, obviously, keeping it out of contact from combustible materials, not mixing it with any organic material. Even, the higher the concentration, the more sensitive it is to organic materials, and the corrosive hazard as well. I would be concerned with, but I would not consider it a peroxide former.
Okay, thanks. The next question, when working with ethers in a research lab setting, what is the recommended disposable glove choice that should be used?
Nitriles. I mean, nitriles will help with ethers. As far as other gloves, I don't know off the top of my head. I would definitely have to look at do a little digging on capacity. But I mean, for lab setting, a nitrile glove would be a good choice.
Okay. Next question. Someone wants to know, how does one get training to use the peroxide strips safely?
Well, using the peroxide strip itself is pretty straightforward. It's really the evaluation. The safety piece is really around the evaluation and understanding what to look for, what the hazard is, and how to make the determination if the material is safe to open. Using the peroxide strip itself is again pretty straightforward. It's essentially a dip test once the material's opened, which is the biggest hazard, is safely opening the material. But once it's open, if it's just dipping the stick in.
Okay.
So from a training standpoint, I really would just be getting that understanding, be it with working with people that have that existing understanding. There's different there's awareness level courses out there, I think, but I mean really working with people that are familiar with it and have that understanding already.
Great, thanks. Next question, someone wants to know, is isopropyl alcohol considered a peroxide forming compound?
So the secondary alcohols, by the structure, secondary alcohols could potentially form peroxides. I can't think of a time where we've run across that, but it is potential basic chemical structure.
Okay. So we have one more question. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to submit them. We have until 3 here, so we have a little bit of time. Next question is, what's the best course of action if I just realized I have peroxide-forming chemicals and hadn't realized before?
I think that initial evaluation by someone who's familiar with the material and what to look for, I think is the most important part. And then you can, depending upon what the evaluation comes back with, you can determine the next step.
Great, thanks. All right, so I think that's it for our questions. So thank you all. We will be concluding our webinar right now. Ted, if you want to flip to the next slide, if there is a next slide. The one after that, maybe. Nope, okay, that's fine. We will send you an email with a copy of the presentation along with a recording later today. I thought I had a slide with a link to our events page, but I guess not. The email will have a link to the events page, so if you guys are interested in attending future webinars, all the events are on there. They are all free, so feel free to attend. The email will also have a link to a survey asking you to rate the webinar. If you could please fill it out, that'd be very helpful to our team here at Triumvirate. We're trying to improve the webinars as we go and come up with things that are relevant to you. In addition to that, everybody will get a copy of our slideshow and a recording. Can everybody hear me? Looks like I just lost connection for a little bit. Thank you all for attending our webinar. That'll conclude our webinar today. Thanks. Bye.